we'll turn it over actually to Bella Rowell, who is ICCI's Antarctica director and also one of the co-authors on this study, to introduce our main speaker. So Bella, please go ahead.
Thank you, Pam. Yeah, good to see you all today. I'm very pleased today to introduce to you Professor Eric Wolff, who is a Royal Society professor in the Department of Earth Sciences at the University of Cambridge and a fellow from the British Antarctic Survey. I also had the pleasure of working with Eric for several years during my time in Cambridge. He studies paleoclimate, especially from reconstructions using polar ice cores. And today, Eric will be talking to us about the main findings from his latest paper published last week in Nature, looking at the Antarctic ice sheet, in particular the West Antarctic, during the last interglacial period. So thank you for being with us today, Eric. And yeah, if you can go ahead and continue. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Isabel. So thank you for the opportunity to talk to everybody here. So yeah, this is very topical because it's just been published. It came from a project funded by the European Research Council. So you can see my nice disclaimers there from the European Union. So what we're talking about is the West Antarctic ice sheet and sea level in the last interglacial. I'll explain what the last interglacial is in a minute, so don't worry if you don't know already. So the West Antarctic ice sheet, just a reminder, I guess everyone on here already knows a little bit about it and why we're worried about it. I'm going to refer to it later as WAIS, so don't be surprised by the acronym. It's the part of Antarctica, hopefully you can see my pointer here, it's the part of Antarctica in the Western Hemisphere. It contains, well, it depends how you calculate it, but it contains of the order 5 meters of sea level. And the reason why we're so worried about it relies on what you can see actually in this figure on the right here, which is altitude. So everything brown is above sea level if you took the ice off it, and everything blue is below sea level if you took the ice off it. So West Antarctica is basically sitting on a bed that's below sea level. And it's considered very vulnerable to instability because of two mechanisms that you don't need to understand, but I'm just going to mention them. The marine ice sheet instability says that as an ice sheet that's a marine ice sheet, in other words, sitting on a bed below sea level, as it retreats inland, because generally speaking, you get these retrograde slopes, meaning it's deeper inland than on the edge, and that's partly because the ice sheet's depressing the land. It actually accelerates. Once you start to retreat it keeps retreating, and that's because there's more flow of ice across this thicker, what we call the grounding line. And then there's a second instability mechanism called the marine ice cliff instability, which is to do with very high ice cliffs being unstable and breaking back. And that's a bit controversial. It's not represented in some models, and it's not clear that it occurs in exactly the way that's shown in this plot. But it's important to know that these two mechanisms exist. Why are we worried about it? Well, it has potentially scary consequences. On the right is a map of what De Conto et al. A couple of years back said would happen to West Antarctica in the year 2300 if we had 3 degrees of global mean temperature. And I think, given where we are at the moment with what's going on in the US and elsewhere, I think despite the brave words that we all like to say that 1.5 degrees is not completely lost, I think most of us, I'll probably get shouted at for saying this, but I think most of us think that 3 degrees is by far the more likely scenario for where we're headed. And it shows that most of West Antarctica disappeared. Would have disappeared. There's a big chunk out over on this side, that's the Amundsen Sea side, and these ice shelves here, crucially, have gone missing in this model realization. And when you look at sea level into the future, a lot of these rises, depending on the pathway that you take, are due to loss of West Antarctica. And in particular, in IPCC, they put on this dashed line here, which was based on this more aggressive model that I'm showing you on the right, and said this is not completely impossible. This is what one model says might happen. And they actually said it could be 15 meters in 2300, which obviously is horrific. So it's quite scary if West Antarctica really is as vulnerable as at least this particular model says. So the problem is that we can't observe either of these two instability mechanisms at large scale because they operate on fairly long timescales. You need to see them happening over decades to centuries to be sure they're really happening and it's not just oscillations. So we can use the past to look at that. We can use the period coming out of the last glacial maximum when obviously the ice sheet was bigger than today and retreated to what it is today. And we have done that, but I'm only going to talk about that in maybe two minutes or less. But we can also look at the last interglacial, and I'll explain why that's important, to see how and whether these mechanisms were operating in the past. And the idea is to find locations that would be sensitive to important components of West Antarctic ice sheet stability. So the last interglacial, why is it important? And this plot, it's a little complicated, but it shows you why. It's essentially the red curves are temperature across the period of the last interglacial, so that's 140 to 110,000 years ago. It's the last time that Earth's orbit was in such a state that we lost the ice sheets. And the crucial thing to see is that in both polar regions, it was warmer than today by some degrees, by actually about the amount we're expecting by 2100 under say a 3-degree warming scenario. So it's more than 3 degrees in the polar regions, of course. So say 6 degrees in Greenland, 4 or 5 degrees in Antarctica. That's about what we're expecting in 2100. The whole world wasn't necessarily much warmer than today, a little bit, but not much. The reason for this warming is to do with changes in the Earth's orbit, nothing to do with CO2. CO2 was about the same as pre-industrial. So what happened to sea level in the last interglacial? Well, actually, we know it was higher than today. So there was a review paper in 2015 that came up with this number of 6 to 9 meters higher. You can get 1 meter of that from thermal expansion of the ocean and from mountain glaciers, and probably 2 meters from losing part of Greenland. Some people say 5 meters, but most studies say 2 meters. So that would imply that you've got to have substantial ice loss from Antarctica. Now, there was a recent paper, which is what I've plotted on the right there, which suggested that 6 to 9 is a bit too high, that it's maybe 1 to 3 meters higher. But even then, you need a loss of ice from Antarctica because we don't think that the loss from Greenland occurred until much later in the interglacial. So what we're saying is we think we need, in order to understand the sea level records, these come from corals, in order to understand the sea level records, that you need some ice loss from Antarctica and most probably West Antarctica. So did it happen? So ice sheet models, I've already referred to them, suggest how it could have happened. The study, DeConto and Pollard, this study in 2016 that receives a lot of attention, suggests how it could have been lost in the last interglacial. And you can see the scary type scenario they found where really West Antarctica just became a series of islands. The ice shelves were completely lost and they had 7 or 8 meters of sea level from it. And in particular, for this study, they showed rapid retreat of the Ronny ice shelf, which is today sits in here, due to warming underneath it, what we call hydrofracture, which is breakup of the ice shelf and subsequent ice cliff collapse through this Mickey mechanism I talked about. On the other hand, other ice sheet models say it wasn't quite as bad. So this is from Golledge et al. They show a little bit of ice loss over here in the Amazon Sea sector for the last interglacial, but these ice shelves still in place. And it's worried me for more than a decade that we've got no hard evidence either way. It seems obvious to me that you ought to know whether the West Antarctic ice sheet was there or not 120,000 years ago, and yet we don't know. It seems to be a very difficult thing to know about. So the question in this study is when and by how much did the West Antarctic ice sheet retreat? And we're not going to fully answer that, but we're going to go a fair way towards it, I think you'll see. So the concept is to drill at places around West Antarctica. So this is West Antarctica. You know there's a core drilled at Waste Divide right in the middle of West Antarctica, but that only goes back 60 or 70,000 years. And so it doesn't tell us whether the West Antarctic ice sheet was there in the last interglacial. It doesn't go back beyond 60,000 years, not because the ice sheet was lost, but because there's melting at the base of the ice sheet, which has taken off the old ice. So the idea is that you should drill at places around the ice sheet that you think will have survived the last interglacial, but they should feel whether the West Antarctic ice sheet was there or not. And there's a US plan to drill at Hercules Dome here in the next few years. And we were drilling at this place called Skytrain Ice Rise, which is nicely situated between the Ronny ice shelf here and the West Antarctic Ice Sheet here. Why is it such a good place to drill? Well, firstly, models, even that very aggressive model that said you lost all of the West Antarctic Ice Sheet still has an ice sheet, a separate ice dome on Skytrain ice rise. So it's a separate flow center, completely independent from the inland ice, mainly because it's got very high mountains, the highest mountains in Antarctica behind it. So it's sensitive to the West Antarctic Ice Sheet here. It's sensitive to the Ronnie Ice Shelf here. It's got excellent radar layering. So this is where we look at these internal layers in the ice from radar. And if you see them looking nice and ordered and parallel, then that implies that you've got good ordering. You haven't got problems with ice flow. And crucially for us, it's 650 meters deep, which is about the amount that we can reasonably drill in one field season. So the cost is not unreasonable. So we drilled there in 2018 to 19. It's a hard place to get to. It's actually one of the most remote places in Antarctica from Rothera Station, the British station. It's actually 3 hops by Twin Otter of about 2 hours each to get here. And that's on the bottom right. You can see what the campsite looked like where we went. There were 8 of us in the field at the most in the end to drill to 650 meters. And we succeeded. We got to the bottom. I mean, when I say we got to the bottom, what that means is we started to drill ice that had small pebbles in it, about a few millimeters across. That means we're very near the bed. We didn't manage to obtain bedrock, but we did get to the bottom of the ice sheet. It's frozen at the bottom. It's very cold at the bottom. So we know that we've got a good ice score. And then we analyzed it, cutting it into sections to analyze it for all kinds of different things. I'll only talk about a few of them, so I won't expand on that for now. And a lot of the work was done by melting the ice on a melter, a hot plate that then sucks it much slower than that shows. This is speeded up, but then sucks the liquid into various analytical instruments. And I think this film actually came from Isobel, so thank you for that. So, okay, but we haven't got time to look at that. So the first key thing is to prove to ourselves that it really had ice from the last interglacial in it. I'm not going to go into any detail about how we did that for reasons of time. I've put on how we dated it, mainly by comparing it with previous ice cores that go back much further from East Antarctica in various things. I can just show you one plot to try and convince you of how we do it. So if you just look at this plot down here, in the blue is the methane from our ice core, and in the black is the methane from other ice cores. And I don't think you have too much difficulty believing that we could tie these 2 ice cores together in time very closely. And that actually applied right back beyond 100,000 years. So we ended up with an age scale that looks like this. There's age in hundreds of thousands of years, kiloyears BP, so 125,000 years here at the top, and depth along here. Don't worry about the blue line, which is to do with uncertainty. You'll see there's a nasty grey bit here. That's where we actually did have some folding in the ice, which we could identify. But luckily, it stopped folding below here. And actually, we've got very old ice at the bottom. We've got ice 400,000 years old at the bottom. So we don't have any doubt that the ice sheet has been there at Skytrain ice rise through the last interglacial. We do have some folding near the bed, but luckily the section through the last interglacial is in the right order. And in order to convince you of that, I can show you a plot here, which is methane and delta 18O of the atmosphere. Don't worry what that is, but it's completely independent from the methane. The blue line is what I call a reference line. That comes from the Dome C ice core. And the red and green are the data that we got across this section. And so I don't think you have too much difficulty believing that we've got a good age scale here. And indeed, some of these values here don't actually occur anywhere else in the last 200,000 years in the Dome C ice core. So we must have last interglacial ice. Okay, so now from now on, just pretend that you believe my age scale. We actually first looked at what happened as we came out of the last glacial maximum. And what we found was a sequence of events where the ice was grounded in the Ronnie ice shelf. It was no longer an ice shelf. It was actually stuck on the rock. And as you came out of the last glacial maximum, it thinned. And that allowed a lot of ice flow out of Skytrain ice rise, and then the ice shelf broke back after that. So I'm not going to talk about that anymore, but just to say that this was actually a nice example of how rapidly ice can change, because the ice thinned at Skytrain ice rise by 400 meters in 2 centuries. And that's the sort of thing that can happen in the future if we got other areas that stop grounding on bedrock. But this study is about the last interglacial. And the big question that we answered is what happened to the Ronnie Ice Shelf. So the Ronnie Ice Shelf, you remember, is that area of floating ice. So it's proper land ice that's floated out onto the ocean. It's not frozen sea ice. It's several hundred meters thick currently, and it's several hundred kilometers wide from the back here to the front. And what we do in the biggest part of this study is to measure the sea salt concentration in the ice core. And sea salt is controlled by all sorts of things, but the biggest thing it's controlled by is how far away you are from the source, which of course is the open ocean and sea ice. So the concept is that the marine ions, sodium and chloride, decrease in concentration as we move from the ice edge inland, which was demonstrated in a spatial study more than 30 years ago, which looked like this. Actually, the data are shown here from the spatial study, and you can see the sodium concentration, so sodium obviously a big component of sea salt, decreases hugely as you go inland. So Skytrain ice rise is currently here, about 650 kilometers away from the edge of the ice shelf. So you'd expect the concentration to be down here at about 50 parts per billion. And if the ice shelf disappeared, you'd expect the concentration to be here at about 400 parts per billion. So that should be really easy to see. And what we actually found, here's the last 10,000 years, the present concentration, and here's what we found in the last interglacial. And the concentration is actually lower in the last interglacial than today, which says that the ice shelf not only didn't retreat, but may actually have been a little bit bigger than it is today. So here's the data from that Minikin study. I've now put it on a log scale, so that's why it looks a bit different. It's exactly the same data I showed in the previous plot. So here's that spatial data. Skytrain fits exactly onto the line today, the modern data, and the last interglacial is a little bit lower, implying that the ice shelf was probably a little bit extended and finally reached the Holocene level about 120,000 years ago, but never went up to 400 parts per billion. So the ice shelf never disappeared. There is one little wrinkle on that statement, that we don't actually have any ice from about 128 to 126,000 years ago. It's again due to a flow disturbance. It's probably because there's very soft ice from the interglacial next to very hard ice from the glacial, causes a kind of thinning of the ice that loses the ice. It's definitely not because the ice wasn't there or because there was no snowfall. However, you can't really imagine a scenario in which the ice shelf disappeared 128,000 years ago at the very height of last interglacial warmth and managed to regrow during that very warm period to be there at 126,000 years ago, when we can show that it's larger than it is today. So I'm very confident that the ice shelf was there, and therefore this very extreme modelling study that said that the ice shelf disappeared is not correct. There may be several reasons why it's not correct. I'll come back to that maybe in a minute. We also looked at water isotopes in the ice, and that's a slightly more complicated story. But what we see is that the water isotopes eventually showed very similar levels to today, but at some stage they were a little bit warmer than today. So that's what this means. It means that the temperature at Skytrain ice rise was somewhat warmer than it is today during this period of the interglacial, whereas in other sites around Antarctica, it's the same as today, more or less. So the difference here is either due to a change in elevation at Skytrain. If it was thinner and lower elevation, it would be warmer, or due to West Antarctic ice sheet having partly disappeared, leading to a change in atmospheric circulation that makes it feel warmer at Skytrain ice rise. So there was a big modelling study carried out by Marina Deutsch, Eric Steig and others in 2023 using a high-resolution model, and they predicted that if West Antarctic ice sheet disappeared, Skytrain ice rise should see a 4 per mil. Don't worry, just think of the number, 4 per mil change in the last interglacial. And what we actually found was 2 per mil. So if you take it with a very naive interpretation, you could say what we're saying is that maybe the West Antarctic ice sheet half disappeared, or half of it disappeared. I wouldn't go to the stake for that, and we didn't put a number in the paper, but it's at least the result, the signal we see is about half what you'd expect if waste collapsed completely. So that means there was certainly loss of ice from the West Antarctic ice sheet, but it's not the full loss of the West Antarctic ice sheet, and definitely not the Ronny ice shelf. So a summary for the last interglacial, and there's a couple more slides after this, so if you're wondering when I'm going to finish. Ice has been present continuously at Skytrain for the last 400,000 years, so we didn't kind of lose everything at any point. We've got a nice record for most of the last interglacial. We can say pretty definitely the Ronny ice shelf didn't disappear in the last interglacial. The water isotopes are hard to interpret, but suggest that West Antarctic ice sheet definitely retreated significantly, but not to the full extent suggested in models. So it's kind of good news and bad news. The waste retreated, but not in the extreme way that some models suggested. So at least our data are more consistent with this model from Golledge et al. Than with DeConto et al. It might be right for the wrong reason, and this might be wrong for the right reason, but that's the result nonetheless. Some of you may be thinking, and you'll be wondering why I'm saying this if you don't know what I'm talking about, what about the octopus? And the reason I'm saying that is because there was a study about almost exactly a year ago looking at genomics, looking at the spread of genetic material across Antarctica. And basically what they said is that the similarity of octopus gene, a particular species of octopus genome here is more similar to the genome over here than it should be if the way that the genome was that the gene information was transferred was around the outside like this, and that you could only get this if there was actually seaways between the Ronny ice shelf, the Amundsen seaside, and the Ross ice shelf. So I don't claim to understand the biology behind this, but it's kind of worrying, and we spent a lot of time thinking, well, how does that work if we're saying that this is completely ice covered? And so there isn't a seaway, an open seaway across here, because if there was, we would see a lot of sea salt. How does that work? And eventually we realized with our modeling colleague, Nick Golledge, that he had model runs in which were consistent with both our interpretations, because he had a seaway across here and indeed across here, but it was a deep ocean seaway. So there's a channel at the bottom of the ocean and there's an ice shelf still over the top of it. So you wouldn't expect to see sea salt here where our core was drilled, because there's still ice cover all around us. But you would expect the octopus genome to be able to transfer across there in a deep channel. Now, I'm not entirely comfortable with that because I don't understand the biology of how the octopus can do that, because they don't go in one go. They've got to have food on the way, I guess. But nonetheless, there is a solution that's compatible with these two ideas. So what are the implications for the future, finally? So I'd say the last interglacial doesn't provide evidence to support the worst case scenario for the future. So that's kind of a few what a relief. I think probably I can't speak for IPCC. I think you would think twice about whether you wanted to put that dashed line onto the plot if you knew that it didn't do that in the last interglacial, although that, again, as I say, could be for a different reason. I can't rule out that the dashed line is right, because if the warm water ate the Ronny ice shelf from below in a way that didn't happen in the last interglacial, that's something I can't judge. But at least the atmospheric warming in the last interglacial wasn't enough to get rid of the Ronny ice shelf. But on the other hand, the waste did retreat and sea level did rise. So it's not that we're out of the woods. You've still got to think of a sea level rise of meters, 2 or 3 meters at the minimum, in the long run, being committed to if we reach 3 degrees, say, in 2100. So it's good news and bad news. I'd have liked to put it out as a pure good news story, but it isn't, I'm afraid. So with that, I'll stop sharing my screen and see if I've left any time for you to ask me any questions.
Thank you so much. No, we have plenty of time for questions, so please go ahead if you're able to stay a bit longer.